All right. Well, welcome back, everybody. It is great to be here with you in week 6 of our course on Laudato Si. We're clicking along toward the finish now. This is our second to last session, the penultimate session, as we continue the turn that we began last week from sort of theory to practice, and talk in particular, about the theme of chapter 6, education and spirituality and kind of prayer and all that stuff that's wrapped up with that. And as somebody, I mentioned early on in our course that I came to the study of theology by working as a liturgist, liturgical musician. So I want to say again, happy Easter to everybody, just as a reminder that the season continues, right? The season of life and joy and light and all these wonderful things. Resurrection from the dead is not just that one Sunday, but is a whole 50-day, joyful celebration, a feast, whatever you want to call it, that culminates right with the coming of the Spirit at Pentecost, in a few more weeks from now. And so let's keep ourselves, as we talk tonight about, prayer and Eucharist and celebration and this festival of creation, right? The sort of the imagery that Francis uses here toward the end of the encyclical. Keep ourselves focused on this festival time for us, and not lose sight of the joy of that, because I think it can always be good to lean into the resurrection a little bit, given how heavy the material that we've been talking about can be, and all of that kind of stuff, to keep in mind that hope that we have as Christians, of resurrection and of new life and of all the possibilities that Pope Francis keeps reminding us, much can be done. Keep in mind those possibilities, and that's what we'll be talking about more and more as we forge ahead to our finish. So welcome once again, happy Easter. Just a reminder, as we've done throughout the course, whenever you have questions or comments or recommendations or whatever it is, feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to send those along, and we will incorporate those as we go through our study of chapter 6 tonight. So, plan for the evening is the usual thing. We'll do a brief kind of go around the room, have folks here in our seminar group share some insights to kind of get us into the conversation, and then we'll use that as a springboard into my own commentary, my own sort of exploration of what chapter 6 has to offer us, and then we'll come back around and open it up again for questions and discussion. What I'd invite you to keep in mind as we go through that process tonight, and as we move toward a finish tonight, is that next week when we get to chapter 7, there is no chapter 7, when we get to week 7, right, which I've added to this course, we're going to be making a really strong turn toward practical application. And by that I mean dreaming up stuff we can do together in our families, in our religious communities, in our homes, in our neighborhoods, in our churches, and whatever it is. And one of the things that I'll say to the seminar group here, but also to everybody who's joining us in the webinar space, is that I'd love for everybody to come in with at least one idea, whoever you are, wherever you are, for some implementation idea, some practical program, or even a small set of actions. Maybe it's rooted in something that we've discussed over the course of the last 6 weeks. Maybe it's something that we haven't discussed that has come to mind. And a guide for that will be the Laudato Si action platform, which I will share the link to at the end and say a few words about at the end of tonight's session, so that everybody has a chance to check that out before we meet next week and start to talk about that really practical turn. So that's where we're going in these last 2 weeks of the course. It's been great being with you all. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and your insight and in your questions and everything. And I look forward to exploring this last chapter starting right now. So thanks for being with us. So I want to open it up to our room here, to our seminar participants, maybe hear from 3 or 4 people, as we have typically, about some key insight, something that struck you, stood out to you, something that you questioned or engaged as you read chapter 6. So Carol, please start us off.
Well, it's good to be with you again, Paul, and everybody. We just had an educational program for our congregation on Saturday on Laudato Si and ecological spirituality. So we concentrated on this chapter. And we had a guest speaker who had been doing days of reflection on Laudato Si out in the parishes. His name was Monsignor Howe. And one of the themes that he picked up on in the whole encyclical, but I was just reviewing chapter 6, and it's mentioned in chapter 6 a lot, is he said he counted 43 times in the encyclical that the word beauty or beautiful is used. So the theme of beauty is throughout it, and it really is there a lot. I mean, he mentions about the Eastern Church calling God beauty in 235. He says that people that don't have a sense of aesthetics or beauty are going to be, see people as objects rather than a communion of subjects. So I had never gotten that before before his presentation on that. So I thought that was a good insight on the importance of beauty in this encyclical.
Yeah, absolutely, Carol. That's wonderful that you bring it in. And I think, especially in the 6th chapter, that probably comes through because we get into sort of, what we call the sacramental imagination or the Catholic imagination sometimes, right? Seeing the world as a sacrament of God and of God's grace, a revealer of God's grace. And, I agree. I mean, I think it's right, and Pope Francis acknowledges this, that it's really our Orthodox brothers and sisters who traditionally, often like our Muslim brothers and sisters too, have come up with and really put forward this close association of God with the beauty of creation. That creation itself, because it is God's handiwork, right? Because it is a sacrament of the divine presence, right? It is the mediator of God among us, is such a wonderful and beautiful place. And so I think back to, everything that we've been saying over the last 6 weeks about perception and attunement and being able to have the eyes to see. Well, I think in some ways, Carol, this is something we should lift up every time we talk about Laudato Si, because the first way I think that we kind of make contact with God's presence in creation is simply by beholding how beautiful things are. Those little moments when we see, a bird in the tree or the hummingbird zips by, and you kind of see that and you have that moment of like, oh, that's so neat. That's so cool. That's so beautiful. Or, the Grand Canyon or a mountaintop view or whatever it might be that we find beautiful. Fall leaves. That's always been something for me that I love to behold, to actually see that and in and through our sacramental awareness, let that remind us of the beauty that God is and the beauty that God gives us. I think it can awaken us to this idea of seeing creation as a gift, which is another part that is a really strong emphasis throughout the encyclical, but especially in chapter 6, to see creation as a gift, just like the gifts that we offer at the Eucharistic table or whatever it might be. So yeah, there's so much that can be done with that. And I think, as we're talking about the shift toward programs, the shift toward action, maybe there's a beauty program. Maybe there's a parish program reflecting on the beauty of creation and asking then, what does that necessitate? What sort of moral or ethical demands does it put on us when we reflect on how beautiful creation is? There's so much creativity, so much we can do with that. So it's a great place to start. Thank you, Carol. Yeah, let's go to others. Colleen, please.
So, building on that, so much of this chapter jumped out at me because it's about education and raising awareness. I work in education and I am an educator. And actually today in class, this concept came up of the beauty of creation versus the value or the services of creation, right? We talk about ecological services or ecosystem services, and we try to put a dollar value on that. But I raised the question to the class that, in addition to the utilitarian value of an ecosystem, doesn't an ecosystem likewise have intrinsic value just for the beauty of creation and the fact that it is created by God and has a sanctity to it and whatnot? And the students really contemplated that, and I think appreciated, from their various religious traditions that that was true. But I think that needs to come out even more in our environmental and ecology classes, that it's not only a dollar value that we put on the medicinal value of plants, but we have to appreciate the beauty from coming from God.
I think that's right, Colleen, and I really appreciate that, especially in light of the first part of this chapter, right? Because we talked a lot last time about economics and consumerism and those sort of patterns. It's been a big theme because it really is the underlying thread of the problem throughout Laudato Si. And the fact that Francis opens this chapter, second paragraph, 203, talking about compulsive consumerism, right? That's his term, compulsive consumerism. I mean, think about that. That's all about instrumental value. And I think what beauty does, and this is a great link between Carol's comment and yours, Colleen, what beauty does is it forces us to resist the sort of reduction of things to their economic value, or even to their sort of ecosystem services value, because as you were saying, often, and sorry for if you hear noise outside my window, there's construction going on. But even that idea of ecosystem services becomes very quickly an economic concept. We talk about what do ecosystems provide us with? Well, that's a very anthropocentric framing of what an ecosystem is and what it does. Ecosystems are systems of life, are systems of harmony, are systems of beauty that provide for all of the creatures, that live there. And that's their principal function. Before that, we had an economy. I mean, we often forget this. Like our, American capitalist economy is what, 300-400 years old with its sort of antecedents. And in Europe, there were ecosystems before that. There were ecosystems before, the Greco-Roman system of trade, or caveman trading rocks, or, feathers, or whatever it is. All the way before that, there was a different kind of trading, which I would call, trading in life, trading in sort of stability and balance and harmony. And that beauty that is there, I think, is such a symbol, a sacramental symbol, again, of God's life-giving presence throughout all of creation, right? Before there was anything, God was there as that source of life. And so I think what you're suggesting, Colleen, is what also, it's very, coherent. It lines up well with Pope Francis, in that it's sort of like a suggestion that we need to be more radical. He keeps talking about this sort of radical way of seeing things. So let's get beyond seeing ecosystems in terms of their economic value and ask this question of intrinsic value. And I think beauty pushes us to ask that question, because we say, wow, that's incredible. Shouldn't that be protected? Shouldn't that be cared for? But I'd say there's even another more radical or deeper level to that exploration, where we go beyond sort of say, okay, maybe that translates into political action to create a protected space or something like that, a national park or a bird conservatory or whatever it is. We have these conservation things. But then there's even this more radical thing that says, well, what if we saw the whole of creation in that way? Because we can come to understand creation, as Elizabeth Johnson calls it, as God's dwelling place. What if we could come to see creation as the place where God is actually dwelling, and by indwelling creation in this intimate, radical way, is actually there in terms of presence and action. And I don't know about you, but to kind of go back to our discussion of some of these issues before, I'd find it a lot harder to clear cut a forest if I had been raised from childhood seeing that forest or trees as the dwelling place of God that reflects God's beauty in creation. So we've got these sort of three levels: the sort of economic, ecological level, the beauty level that kind of blows that open and calls us to really behold and care for what we find beautiful, and then that theological grounding that says that beauty stems from God's love of it. That beauty stems from our care for it. Now, how do we teach that? How do we preach that? How do we bring that into our celebrations? That's the practical question that I hope, as we move toward the conclusion of this course, we can talk about more and more. So I think that's a great insight, Colleen. It connects beautifully with, I didn't even mean that as a joke, but there you go, with what Carol was saying right before that about the idea of beauty. Any other thoughts, initial things? Maria, please. Maria,
What struck me this weekend, I was reading some articles on Easter celebrations in the Ukraine, in these bombed out buildings, and the power plant where people are holed up inside, and neighbors manage to pass food to each other. In China, the areas that are walled off and quarantined, people are realizing that it's not the Communist Party that will bring them food and walk their dogs. It's actually their neighbors. And it touched me such a great deal to read the previous chapters where Pope Francis talked about a human ecology and the beauty of human relationships that far surpass any crumbling buildings and overcrowded neighborhoods and poverty. And he was saying, even in the midst of squalor and war, you can find and you can create beautiful communities through the relationships between people. And, far surpassing any economic value to that, the human person, creation in the human person, is probably the most beautiful thing that we can find when we realize that we are everything and that needs to be protected. So in the light of Ukraine and the COVID situations and the wars around the world, it was something that brought comfort and actually joy in the midst of situations that are not so joyful.
That's really beautiful, Maria. And I think, what it brings to mind, again, under this sort of umbrella of the rubric of this sacramental imagination idea, is just a beautiful way of seeing the world, to be able to find beauty amid the chaos of war and all those kinds of things. I mean, we talk about these things, and I don't want to romanticize, to the extent that we forget how horrible war is and what people in the Ukraine are really suffering. But we also know, and I think a lot of theologians who have written, especially post-Holocaust, have raised this question, like, how can we continue to sustain our faith in a God who, somehow must have been there somewhere in the midst of the Holocaust? Where was God, right? And, many theologians have in various ways made the argument, well, God was there with the people who were suffering those horrors. God was there in every exchange of love amid, the problem. God wasn't excusing the Holocaust, or God wasn't excusing, or causing, much less causing, things like Hurricane Katrina or the war in the Ukraine. God is actually there on the side of those who suffer, just as God always has been. If you look at the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, standing with them in solidarity with their suffering and drawing them through the fullness of life. Now, how does that happen? That's the question, right? It happens through these little exchanges of love and these little exchanges of compassion. The 20th century author, early 21st, David Foster Wallace, maybe some of you are familiar with him, has a commencement address that he called "This is Water," that he gave at Kenyon College way back. And he tells this story in the midst of this really interesting kind of very unorthodox commencement address. He says, it's like the story of these two guys who meet at a bar, and they're up in Alaska, and they're talking about, they're sharing stories. One of them is a devout theist, probably a Christian, maybe Muslim, maybe Jew, devout theist. And the other one is a devout atheist, right? And so they get into this conversation. And the atheist starts telling this story about a time the week before he had been stranded up in the tundra in Alaska and nearly froze to death. And he said, I felt like I was helpless. I didn't know what would happen. And even though I know God isn't real, I prayed, God, come save me. And, a few hours later, whatever, these two Eskimo guys, came by and saved me from freezing to death. And the other guy's like, well, couldn't that have been God? And he's like, no, they were just Eskimos. The atheist says, no, they were just, but this is an imagination level, thing, that the ability to see God in all things, which is a principle of Ignatian spirituality, of course, right, that Francis quotes in this chapter, is all wrapped up, in those sort of exchanges. And I'd also say that those kinds of exchanges, the sharing of food, the walking of pets, the sort of awakening of our consciousness, also has this really deeply Eucharistic character to it. Never forget that, at the end of the Gospel of Luke, after the resurrection, here we are in the Easter season, and we'll be hearing the story soon. We get the story of the road to Emmaus, right? Jesus walking with the Mary and Clopas, right? Walking with them on the road from Jerusalem. And it's not until he sits down at home with them and breaks the bread that they recognize who he was. And so Christ is being made present in that moment of sharing food, in that moment of community, in that moment of people coming together. And what happens out of that, right, is that they learn to see in a different way. That's their moment when they can recognize this person, mysterious person who had been walking with them as Jesus. And there's something to that, about that sharing, that communal coming together, breaking bread on the road, being present on the road amid all that suffering, amid all the horrors of what happened to Jesus and all these things that God has made present. And I think that when we're talking about ecological education and spirituality, we need to never forget that the Eucharist began in the early church. The Eucharist began as a meal that was simply celebrated in people's homes, right? And it derives from the Passover, but it wasn't always, the bread and the wine at the big altar with all the, smells and bells, as people say, and, the singing and all that kind of stuff. It was centered, and Paul, attests to this in his writings, right, in the New Testament, that it was centered on a meal of the community. And there's something about that symbol of the table fellowship, the coming together, that's so important in Jesus's ministry, as many scholars, especially feminist New Testament scholars, have pointed out, that we need to really sit with and dwell on. And I think there's real beauty in those connections with what you're talking about here too. It's great. We have one last preliminary. Well, two. Let's do them both. Okay, Barbara, go ahead.
I'm conscious of the man, Francis, and his namesake, and all the other people that we could name that are attractive to people. So why have so many people wanted to do this? It has to do with the leaders, who's involved and who's doing it. So I would think one of the things that and I was also conscious, Paul, that you said the priest at your church doesn't preach it. And I think maybe that's just as well, because if he's not an attractive person, let's not have him talk about it. But the people that are doing something, that are gathering people around them, that are joyful and productive and generative, I think it would be great to lift out what they're doing and then talk about their lives, not just to sort of tell stories. The telling stories is good, but also to point out some running support beams that in fact support their lives. So rather than start abstractly, which can slide over into guilt, you shouldn't do that and you should be doing this and stop doing that, to look at what is working, what is attractive, what is vital and fun, and then say, who are those people and where are they and can we join with them? That's what I would do for spirituality and education.
I love that, Barbara, and bring that back next week and
Yes,
develop it and say more about it. This sort of like, but the storytelling approach, you said it's not just storytelling, and it's not, right? Because we are the stories that we tell. We become the stories that we hear, right? When we get inspired by a Pope Francis or somebody, or a really good parish priest, right, who knows how to preach this stuff or whatever it is, we are inspired to action. So how do we find those stories, whether they're of St. Francis or Pope Francis, or somebody that I love to read, Wendell Berry, who I've mentioned before, who just inspires me to action. The other Berry in this conversation, right? Not Thomas, but Wendell. When I read his work, and this is kind of an odd example maybe to use, but there's a great essay on consciousness raising by a political philosopher named Iris Marion Young, who wrote in the late 90s and things. And she's talking about the basis of things like racism and systematic sort of forms of oppression. And she says, and I never forget like how much this struck me the first time I read it. In the midst of the short essay, she says, let me give you an example of this. 200 white people, basically mostly white people, are gathered for a business convention in a hotel. At some point, as people are arriving, a Black man walks into the room who doesn't appear to be one of the members of the hotel staff, and the decibel level of the conversation drops for a moment, 20 decibels, and it's measurable. And then it goes back up because maybe, this person sees. But she's like, if you want to understand, racism, if you want to understand the way these things hide, think about situations like that. And that to me is like, it's a negative story, but it's also a story of something that raises our awareness. So what are those stories that we can tell? Perhaps the story like we have, told many times in this course of capitalism and technology, those stories, right? These are stories that we can all, and this is a big part of Francis's emphasis in this chapter, we can all choose to believe those stories and live according to them, or we can choose to reject those stories and choose other ways of living, build other kinds of community that aren't so closely attached to, the way that, society appears to be structured. Because just because it looks like it's structured that way doesn't mean that it has to be, right? And so in the alternative example of a Francis or of a Pope or saint, we can find this sort of, we almost might call it, if you want to play loosely with words, for example, here for a second, we might even call heretical, not with respect to religion, but with respect to the status quo of the way that our Catholic Church operates, or the way that our economic system operates. Sometimes you have to be a heretic. You have to be willing to sort of go against the grain. And I think St. Francis of Assisi did that in a really radical way. So how do we tell a story in a way that raises our consciousness, invites us to think differently about things? That's such a powerful tool, and I think that's a great basis for a program. So I look forward to exploring that even more next week. Yeah, Frank, please.
What jumped off the page at me in the rereading tonight was in paragraph 236, where he writes that Eucharist joins heaven and earth. It embraces and penetrates all creation. It's such a powerful image and thing to spend time on. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons it jumped off the page at me today was it was the subject of Richard Rohr's meditation this morning. And it just offers so much fruit for our own understanding of God's indwelling in earth and the matters of earth. Absolutely.
That's a great example. I'm going to say quite a bit about paragraph 235, 236, 237, the Eucharist part when we get there. So I'll save my sort of bulk response, till that point. But what I'll say at this point is just don't forget that, and I say this a little bit, humorously, because, we all know our hosts are, once I heard him referred to by a priest as styrofoam Jesus, that, they don't seem a lot like bread, but they are made up of little particles of wheat and water fused together and prepared, right? In the prayers of the gifts, we hear all this language of creation, fruit of the vine and work of human hands, this beautiful merger of creation imagery with human labor, but in a way that produces something that is more than what, nature provides on its own, and more than what we can provide simply without those resources. It's a fusion. It's an act of making bread and wine is a collaborative action between humanity and creation. And that is the basis for our Eucharistic species, for the bread and wine that we believe become the body and blood of Christ. So it's not just symbolically, sacramentally, it isn't just the bread and wine like a magic trick that, oh, look, they were that and now they're this, but it's a symbol of the entire creation being transfigured. It's a sign of the entire creation being fulfilled in its ultimate sort of sanctified form in communion with God. Little things like grapes and wheat, crushed and broken and mixed with water and all these kinds of things. They're a sign of the whole of creation being united to God. And our reception of those can be understood as a way of symbolizing not only our relationship to God or to Jesus as the body of Christ, but also we are consuming the fruits of creation. We are consuming the sanctified creation. And let's not forget that we are part of that as well, right? We are the creation, sanctified. And so there's this sort of human creation merger that happens in the reception of communion that parallels the reception of the body of Christ and what that signifies of our union with God. And I think that that's a different way of interpreting the Eucharist, a different way of thinking the Eucharist. We don't often think about receiving the bread and wine as connecting us with the natural world, but they are, because we're consuming the form, right, of what creation will be one day. So I think that's really great, Frank. I'll say a little bit more about that. I just said way more than I wanted to. And I also got the idea for an article that I've never written and I never had before. So I appreciate that. When those things happen, I'm like, I should write about that someday. I'll put it on my list. Anyway, thank you all for your comments. And I'll turn over now and give my own commentary, building on what we've talked about here. To the folks out there in the webinar space, feel free to communicate via the Q&A button. Just a reminder that we can't respond to you if you raise your hand, but we can respond to you via the Q&A. So just please use that. And I just dropped in the chat one comment from Tom here in our seminar, referring to the Trinitarian structure of creation, which Pope Francis gets to at the near end, that idea that all of creation reflects God's presence as Trinity. Wonderful. So I'll dive in, talk for a bit, and then we'll bring it back around for some more conversation. So we already said, right at the beginning of this chapter, in chapters 202 or paragraphs 202 and 203, that Pope Francis starts this chapter by reminding us that things need to change, but that amid things needing to change, we need to avoid thinking solely about externals, changing systems or fixing this problem or whatever it is, Band-Aid solutions, and that it's most fundamentally us humans that need to change. We need a new lifestyle, he says, and that it's very easy in the contemporary world to be caught up in this thing that he calls compulsive consumerism that I mentioned in response to Colleen's comment earlier. So what I would say is, to think through the logic of the argument of Laudato Si. That's what I would suggest. In chapter 3, he talks about anthropocentrism and the technocratic paradigm, and consumerism in chapter 5, economics. So this idea of a compulsive consumerism is a function of this thing that he calls the technocratic paradigm. It's a product of the technocratic paradigm. And what I mean by that is that in recognizing this connection between the technocratic paradigm and our consumer patterns, it means that we have to constantly remind ourselves that the devices and the services we use are not just products that we consume. They're actually factors in how we think and how we see the world. Our technology, our engagement with technology shapes us, right? A lot of people have made decisions not to travel or not to gather in person because of the pandemic. Well, Zoom also enabled that. So now Zoom tells us, oh, there are other ways of relating. There are other ways of kind of being in community, maybe through an electronic medium. What this is doing is not just giving us another thing that we can use, another tool, it's also changing how we think about our relationships, our perceptions of what is ethical, what is right, all of that, our virtues and our values is wrapped up in this. And so every time we pick up our Android or our iPhone, right, we are making an ethical decision to use that product. It's not just a tool. Think about like Wikipedia and the availability of information. That's another great example versus when I was a kid and we had to use encyclopedias, right? And encyclopedias are only published once a year or maybe once every 2 or 5 years, right? You had to get the new edition to get the most up-to-date information on something. Now you can just hop on the web and pull up Wikipedia, and believe me, our students, right? Those of us who teach think you can find anything. You can find truth in Wikipedia. Not always the case, right? But what this does, it doesn't just make information more readily available to us. It also feeds our pattern of consumption. We expect things faster now. We expect that we should be able to have not just information, but food all year round, apples all year round, oranges all year round, even though they're seasonable, fruits and vegetables. We should be able to have everything now. And this gets back to that idea all the way from chapter 1 of rapidification, right? This idea that everything is getting faster. And what Pope Francis says as he interprets this is that this creates feelings of anxiety, of instability, of uncertainty, which lead us to consume more. They compel us to consume more. Oh, well, I don't feel satisfied. I don't feel like I have enough. I look out at the world and Elon Musk just bought Twitter for $44 billion. Could have used the money to, end world hunger or stop climate change, but he bought Twitter. Like we see these kinds of things out there in the world and we learn of them so quickly. And we feel this compulsion to consume. You need more, you need more. And all that is doing, Pope Francis says, is feeding the technocratic paradigm, feeding the economic system that is rooted in the exploitation of peoples and lands. Think again of, buying a banana, and all we've talked about with that. And so what he says is, in reflecting on this, and I love this quote from paragraph 203, he says, we have too many needs and only a few insubstantial ends. We have too many means, too many ways of doing things, and only a few insubstantial ends. The reason why we're doing most things is insubstantial. It's not even really worth it, right? But we choose those things because it's so easy to make those choices. And the technocratic paradigm prompts us, it invites us, it markets itself to us in ways that makes that look attractive. And so we're getting back into these deep sort of human level issues that Pope Francis is so concerned about. And he says another place that this shows up is in our self-centeredness, which whether that's a species-centeredness like anthropocentrism or an individualism, right? Because those paradigms are both rooted and oriented toward human consumption, not the common good, as we've said. Personal needs, or even more so, personal wants, become the ultimate measure of value. And that kind of corresponds nicely with what Colleen was saying about the way that we instrumentalize nature. And we talk about how things are valuable insofar as they're valuable to us. And so in the midst of this problematic, and here I think Pope Francis, he is going a step even beyond some of the things that he said before, really challenging us to think about this. He says, but at the same time, don't forget that it can be different, right? And this is the first time I think I'll mention beauty. To Carol's point, he says in 205, quote, no system can completely suppress our openness to what is good, true, and beautiful, or our God-given ability to respond to grace at work deep in our hearts. And if we can be open to that grace, if we can be open to those other possibilities, that by raising our consciousness calls us to change. It calls us to not just individual change, though that is important, but also to structural change, to systemic change, to societal change, to perhaps, as he says early on, a bold cultural revolution, right? And so he reminds us, again, buying things is always a moral act. And here he flips that on its head and he says, and so let's not forget that practices like boycotting and social pressure and protest can be valuable tools to changing how companies act as well, right? So boycott, don't buy something anymore. If you know that Mondelez or, another company is causing great harm, stop buying their products and get educate people to also participate in that sort of boycotting and see what that can do. And he says, this is one form of doing something that is vital in the midst of the present crisis, which is setting limits, not only on what we consume, but setting limits around what we consider acceptable whenever we're buying and consuming goods, right? So it's two things. In the same way that the technocratic paradigm isn't just about, our iPhones, but also is about the way that we think about the world, boycotting or thinking very carefully, and consciously about how we consume is not just about protest or resistance. It's also taking a stand with respect to what we as Christians say is acceptable in the marketplace. And we do, as Christians, have specific guidance from the Catholic social teaching tradition and which includes Laudato Si, in thinking carefully about how we purchase and consume. Because as he says, we live in a society that is marked by indifference, that is fueled by our consumption. The more and more that we consume without thinking about it, the more indifferent we become, and the more indifferent we enable our whole social system to become. And so he says what we need is not indifference of that kind, but a deep, and he says, disinterested concern for others, meaning a concern for others that doesn't know any limits, that isn't interested in any particular outcome or aim, right? And I would call this a deep universal compassion toward all creation, feeling with, again, that word compassion, that centers our reflection on the impacts of our consumption. Again, think about the impact when we buy something or when we eat something or whatever it is. It's not just about whether I can afford it. It's not just about whether it's right to purchase it. It's also about what happens when we make that choice. And so thinking about what we as Christians and as Catholics consider ethical, consider acceptable in the marketplace, can be a basis for transformative action that also puts pressure on companies and governments and other things to do a little bit of a better job, we might say, of living and helping us to live in harmony with creation. So that's, I think, the first really big point that he makes. And it's a deeper dive that sort of brings together everything he's been talking about in terms of this idea of a bold cultural revolution that we discussed. So this, then, he says, that's the problem, that's where we are, that's how we can move beyond this problem. So how do we educate people? How do we not just educate, but form people into this thing that he calls a covenant between humanity and the environment? And of course, that covenant language is deeply rooted, right, in the ancient Jewish tradition that gives birth to our own Christian tradition. This idea, of a relationship with responsibilities. It's what a covenant is, right? It's an agreement that carries deep responsibilities and also consequences whenever we enter into it. And so he says, he's inspired by younger generation's commitment. There's a great picture of him with Greta Thunberg, right, who, has spoken on these things and was, very much in the news the last few years. But he also recognizes that despite the leadership of younger generations, we also know that many, many, many people are never educated in the way that she has been, or that she has tried to educate others, about alternative ways to live. People aren't just going to change their habits, ex nihilo, like tell them the planet's in danger, but never teach them about the complexities of, consumption, consumerism, or technology, or capitalism. If we never go there, they're never going to get it. And so he says, this is the key. We can't just focus again on band-aids to fix the small things. He says, and I love this, in paragraph around 209, he says, we need to change our myths, right? MYTHS. We need to change our myths. And when I talk about myths, I like to use the definition, a story that sets up a world or a worldview. I think we've talked about this before back in maybe week 2. A story that sets up the world in a certain way. So what are the myths that we believe? What are the stories that we tell ourselves, to Barbara's point earlier? Well, in today's world, we tell ourselves stories about individualism, unlimited progress, competition, consumerism, an unregulated market, right? Those are the things Pope Francis himself lists. And we believe those stories. And when we believe those stories, they shape how we see the world, and thus they shape how we live within the world. And so we got to change our stories. We got to change our myths if we're going to get to that deep level of action. And I'll throw in one of my own commentaries here, a myth or a story that I like to kind of think with a lot, which is the story of evolution, the evolution of the human species, but also the evolution of all species from the beginning of time. And I just don't have time. We could do a science and religion course someday with Spirit Alive too. Maybe down the road, Maria, we'll talk about that one. But before we get there, what I would say is that, keep in mind that the Catholic Church accepts evolutionary theory as true, has since the early 1990s as the proper explanation of the origins of life from a physical standpoint, not from a theological standpoint, from a physical standpoint. But encoded in this story of evolution, we hear things like this: the struggle for existence, the survival of the fittest, right? The competition of the individual organism, one eats the other and gets on top, right? I think that it's not entirely accidental, or maybe not accidental at all, that since the 1800s, the story has increasingly been told in that way. Because when that story becomes a paradigm for human social relations, we see ourselves as humans, as the radical individuals who are struggling to survive and are in competition with one another. The primary sort of baseline of capitalism in the US is that competition drives growth, competition drives progress. But I would just stop and say, okay, what about altruism? What about compassion? What about the mother bird cradling, her little, birdlings, her little baby birds, her chicks, and nurturing them to the fullness of their existence, right? What about the collaboration between species ecologically that allowed for evolution to proceed in the way that it did, there are other ways to tell the story of evolution that aren't all about struggle and competition and this like fight for survival. And I think that, you know, one person has called it not the struggle for existence, but the snuggle for existence, right? That altruism and compassion are deeply integrated into the evolutionary process. So when we tell the story of evolution, we are telling a myth. And I am not saying evolution is a myth in the sense it's not true. That's not what I'm saying. What I mean is we're buying into a certain way of telling the story that when we apply it to our life in the world, sets up a certain idea of humans as these competitive animals that are struggling against one another to advance to get to the top of the food chain. That's an incredibly destructive story to tell, because what it does is it pits people against each other. It pits societies against each other. It has been used to pit races against each other explicitly. It's the basis for the eugenics movement, the early 20th century, and in the Nazi, empire as well. So when we think about these things, I just invite us to reflect. What stories are we believing? And how might we tell the stories that we live within differently in ways that emphasize, great things, good values? And on evolution, for example, the Dalai Lama, speaking on behalf of the Buddhist tradition, totally rejects this idea that evolution is all about struggle and competition. And he says, no, basic human nature is compassion. This is the Buddhist belief. Basic human nature is compassion. Basic human nature is love. Basic human nature is altruism and care. It is the poisons of greed and indifference and sinfulness that get in the way of our vision to see that what we really are is instruments of compassion. And so it's a different way, very close to what Pope Francis is saying there, but a different way of looking at that. What if we started not by saying humans are fallen, but that humans are intrinsically compassionate? And that it's actually the poisons of greed and selfishness and indifference that get in the way of our ability to express that compassion fully. I think the Dalai Lama in the Buddhist tradition in particular, little interreligious moment, has a lot to offer us in that regard. So all of this, to come back to Francis, says, leads us to conclude that the goal of our education should not just be learning facts, which is an instrumental sort of thing. We learn how things work so that we can use them. That's the technocratic paradigm, but should be the acquisition and the internalization of values, in particular, solidarity, responsibility, and compassionate care. He names those three things in paragraph 210, that our education should be about teaching solidarity, responsibility, and compassionate care. So when we teach science, when we teach ecology, when we teach evolution or environmental science, we need to recognize that beyond teaching the facts, we are teaching relationships. We are communicating to people ways of relating, ways of imagining how we, live in the world, the way we eat, the way we pray, the way we, acquire our food, the clothes we wear. All of that is wrapped up in our education. And he goes on to say that, this kind of good ecological education starts at home with the family. That's the core. And so to those of us out there, who live, we all have our families, whether they're chosen or whether they are biological or whatever it is, right? We all have our core communities. And the choices that we make in those core communities, especially when there are children involved, right, communicate from a very early age, again, not just what to eat or what to consume, how we prepare food, whether or not we choose to waste food, right? How easy is it in your house for somebody to say, I'm just going to throw out the rest of this because nobody's going to eat it, right? If you say that in the context of, a Filipino family, for example, the tita or the tito, the auntie or the uncle will intervene and say, no, don't you waste that. This is deeply rooted in many cultural traditions. But for those of us who grew up in the US, we often are taught that throwaway culture that Pope Francis talks about early on. So I asked that question to think about, how easy is it in your family or in your community to waste things, or to say this thing is no longer of value, let's throw it away, rather than asking whether it can be reused, whether it can be saved or, mixed up, make leftover surprise, for dinner tomorrow night with all the leftovers that you've accumulated. It may not be the tastiest thing in the world, but maybe it's better than throwing away all that food that's sitting in the fridge right now, So thinking through those possibilities and those choices, right, are really important. And Francis goes so far, and I would say he starts then to talk about the culture of life and the culture of death. And I would suggest that, and maybe this is a too radical way of putting it, but in many ways, throwaway culture is a way that we participate in a culture of death. It is a way in which we say, this thing is not really useful to me anymore, so I can just get rid of it, right? So if we're going to be a people of life, we need to care for that whole trajectory, as that goes. And I think families and local communities are the places where this can get started, So that's a big suggestion he makes. What are we communicating? If anybody out there, has young children or, is a teacher in a school, whenever we go to, wherever it is we go to shop for our groceries, whenever we buy things, take our kids with us to the store, what are we communicating about what we're buying and why we're choosing to buy this and that? Are we even thinking about it? When we bring it home and prepare it, are we thinking about whether it's all going to be eaten or not? Are we buying 10 pounds of apples when you really only need 2, for your family? Whatever those questions are, I think there's an invitation here to a really mindful mode of consumption. And that's really challenging in light of this sort of compulsive consumerism that we're talking about. So it invites us to really think and be present and think about that. So tell your pastor this, all right, or your administrator or whoever it is. Paragraph 214, I love this quote. Pope Francis says explicitly, this is in an encyclical, it applies to the whole church, quote, all Christian communities have an important role to play in ecological education. It is my hope that our seminaries and houses of formation, and I would add schools, parishes, and universities, everything, will provide an education in responsible simplicity of life, in grateful contemplation of God's world, there's Carol's theme of beauty, and in concern for the needs of the poor and the protection of the environment. Again, all Christian communities have an important role to play in this. So if we're not doing it, then we need to be. We all have a role to play. And this is not really optional. And I think it often gets treated as an add-on. It gets treated as something that we can opt into or opt out of. But Francis is not speaking that language here, So just tell whoever needs to hear that, to quote paragraph 14 to them, 214 to them. All right. So this all frames up the next section, which is the discussion of what he calls ecological conversion. And this is pretty straightforward in light of what we've talked about, a spirituality of appreciation and care for the world. I think it involves, this is my own commentary here, sort of a moving beyond our fixation on sin and salvation in a sort of otherworldly way, and a recognition of the love that we are all called to as Christians, the compassion that we're all called to as Christians. Because if we teach people to love more fully the whole of creation, we are implicitly teaching them to sin less and to work for the salvation of the world and their own salvation. The fulfillment of this thing that we call salvation is love. Like, we don't have to dwell on sinfulness so much to the extent that we lose the thread of this deeper, more radical call to be people of radical love and care. Because if we're doing that, we're probably not sinning. Just to keep it in mind, it's a different way of framing how we understand our faith. Start from love, and then expand the context of that love as an ecological conversion, as he calls it, right? That he says in 217 again is not optional, but is part of what it means to be a Christian, just as St. Francis shows us. We need to overcome this division of the body and the soul, of spirit and nature, of humans and the creation, and integrate it together into a holistic vision of love. And he says, if we do this, we may come to see the world as a gift. We'll see it in its beauty and receive that gift with a sense of God's generosity to us, a spirit of humility, and we'll treat it with care. We care about things that are given to us in love, and then we are called to give of those things to others in love. And this fosters that deeper sense of interconnectedness, this idea, as he says in that paragraph, that everything is together in a splendid universal communion. Might be my favorite 3 words in all of Laudato Si, a splendid universal communion. that calls us, again, as I said earlier, to see the world as God's beloved dwelling place, to use Elizabeth Johnson's, words there for Mass of the Beasts. So this, if we can implement it, here's the theory to practice, will lead us beyond that sort of stopgap solution, technocratic fixes, technological fixes, to allow us and show us ways of using our creativity to foster real and authentic, deep level transformation of the whole world, right? Creativity is not just about making more stuff, right? Creativity can also be about creating a whole different way of living in the world, creating new societies, creating new communities, creating new, art and music that reflect that beauty, that allow us, I think, as he says all in paragraph 221, to see God's presence in everything, to see everything engaged in what, this cosmic liturgy, this cosmic act of praise, right? And I love this quote in 221. He says, "May the power and the light of the grace we have received," there's that image of gift, "also be evident in our relationship to other creatures and to the world around us. May what we have received be evident in the way we live," right? There's a beautiful prayer over the gifts, and I think it's the 21st Sunday in Ordinary Time in one of the lectures, in one of the years, where there's this language where the priest says in the prayer, "By this holy exchange of gifts, may we become what we receive, just as you give to us what you have given." Holy exchange of gifts. Think about that as a model for living in the world, that we live as people in relationship with each other, with God, and with creation under the rubric of a holy exchange of gifts. I think that's again, those other three words are my three favorite words in Laudato Si. That's my favorite prayer, to think with. And so all of this leads to this culmination, celebration in joy and in peace. And he says, that this can be marked by humility and moderation, right? Now, think about those two values, right? Those two virtues in the context of maybe American society or most, sort of things. Humility and moderation, not exactly the hallmarks of sort of, who we are as people, but I think that that's really telling, because rather than being unhappy with what we don't have, right, which is what, the antithesis of moderation, we can be happy with what we do have. And I want to be really clear here that this is not some sort of like redemptive suffering narrative that I'm telling, just like if this is not saying that the poor of the world, the poorest of the poor around our world, should be happy with what they have. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the people who are not poor need to learn, this moderation, that then think of all the resources that would be left over and could be shared with poorer communities as a result, so that everyone can have what they need, right? And so simplifying, reducing, being happier with a little less, he says in 222, can go a long way. He even says, less is more. Let that be our guiding principle. And humility before the gifts of creation, humility before the poor, all of those kinds of things, can be a part of this. And I love that, at the end of the section around paragraph 225, 226, he says this. He says, all of this stuff that we're talking about tonight, ultimately, and I've used this word mindful and presence a bunch of times already tonight. He says, all of this is really about being truly present, right? Being truly present, just as Christ was completely present to everyone and everything, he says, and in this way showed us the way to overcome that unhealthy anxiety, which makes us superficial, aggressive, and compulsive consumers. So he says it's presence of mind, presence of heart, modeling our ability to be present on the way that Christ was present to the world in his historical life and is present to us in the Eucharist, right? That shows us the way to be able to overcome this compulsion to consume, this anxiety about never having enough. And I can't help as somebody that's really interested in liturgy but think about that in relationship to this whole kerfuffle that's been going on, especially or maybe has died down a little bit now, but months ago, was over this Pew Research study, that said, some huge number of Catholics don't believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, right? And I think about this, and I wonder, whether this idea of believing in the real presence of Christ, maybe we've got it a little twisted. And that it's not just about recognizing the fact of Christ's presence in the Eucharist, but about understanding what it means for us to be really present to Christ as Christ is really present to us. Perhaps our Eucharistic celebrations, aren't enabling us to see that presence fully. And if we could, bring that about and reflect that out, then blow that up and say, yeah, and Christ isn't just present here on this table, though in a special way, sacramentally, of course, he is, but Christ is also present in the primordial sacrament of creation in the whole world, right? Keep in mind the connection, like Frank was kind of pointing us to, between the bread and the wine on the altar and the wheat and the grapes and the water and all the things that go into making that sacrament present to us. Christ takes the form not only of a human, but in the Eucharistic species, Christ enters the form and becomes, right, wheat and grapes and water. The whole of creation is sanctified in this. And I think there's a really beautiful possibility here for reimagining the Eucharist in terms of some of these things. This is my article that I want to write. The wheels are already turning. So this is kind of some ways to think about this. And this brings us to those great paragraphs on sacramentality, to the Eucharist, in paragraphs 235 through 237. So if we can see all of creation as a sacrament of God's presence, right? Even saying in some ways that creation is the first sacrament, the primary mediator of God's presence to us. Because without creation, we couldn't know God. Without creation, there is no mechanism by which Christ enters the world, because there is no world, right? It's through creation, through that whole evolutionary history of the cosmos, that God has made God's self known to us. And it's that allows us to enter in to the mysteries of our faith. And so Francis then reminds us, right, that the sacramental symbols we use are natural symbols: water, oil, wine, fire, right? All of those kinds of things. Even our embodiedness, right, is a reflection. Even the fact that we have like flesh and blood is a reflection of that history and a reflection of our connection to Jesus Christ, the fulfillment of that history. And so Francis then says, that the Eucharist reveals the fullness of creation. In the bread and wine, we taste the sanctification of the whole cosmos, of the whole world. And I agree 100% in principle on this. And as I just said, I do think, though, sometimes Francis in this paragraphs tends a little bit idealistic about what people are actually getting when they go to Mass on Sunday, what they're receiving in terms of their ability to see this connection between the bread and the wine and the sanctification of the cosmos. Maybe a little too idealistic. I mean, he's right. Theologically, 100%, that's wonderful. But, have you been to church on Sunday lately? Is this being communicated to our communities, right? That's what I would ask. And I think that raises the question of the quality of our Eucharistic celebrations. Again, this question of real presence so often gets understood in terms of a commodity, right? That the wafer, the host, is the body of Christ, and the thing that goes into your hand is a commodity that you receive, as if we can contain Christ, or reduce Christ to a wafer and some wine, right? The symbol mediates the truth of Christ's real presence to us, right? And symbol I'm using here in a technical theological way, which means actually makes it present, not represents in a secondary way, just to clarify that. I don't mean that would be a sign. That's different. So, the sacramental symbol, the bread and the wine, mediate Christ's presence to us. But I think that sometimes we objectify and commodify even the presence of Christ and reduce it to the host, when actually and that leads us to forget that the celebration of the Eucharist, the action of the Eucharist, is what makes Christ present in the assembly, in the person of the priest, in the bread and wine, and in the word, as Vatican II teaches us, right? So I'd like to call us to account for that dimension, because I think that it helps us to get past this idealism and really say, okay, that's true theologically, Francis, but how are we making this real? How are we making this real presence real in our celebration of the Eucharist? And that then leads us back in, right, to this last part, which Tom mentioned, this idea that the whole web of relations of creation, which is celebrated at the Eucharistic table, mirrors God's Trinitarian life. And as creatures tend toward God, they also tend toward each other. It's two parts of a single movement. For creation to become more fully itself is for creation to become fulfilled in relationship with God. And so it's the love of God and the love of neighbor principle, right? Whenever, Jesus says, you shall love God with all your whole heart and strength, quoting the Hebrew Bible, and, right, you will also, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, ultimately, those are a single love. To love God is to love one's neighbor, and rightly understood, to love one's neighbor is to love God, because God is love, right? That's the logic. Well, same way, to love creation is to love one's neighbor, because creation is our neighbor too, right? And to see creation with a sense of beauty and awe and wonder, right? As he says, in paragraph 243, in which seeing creation in a way that we see each creature resplendently transfigured, right, allows us to see the fulfillment of who God is to us. And so that, I think, this leads us to this theme of praise, right? And maybe here again, we return to the Garden of Eden one last time, not only to that original beautiful order of the flourishing garden where food was abundant and everything was plentiful until we messed it all up, right, with our pride and with our choice to, thanks God, I will take it from here moment. And just to remind ourselves that these breakdowns in the relationship between humans and nature, between men and women, between humans and animals, all of these breakdowns that Genesis 2 sort of, in its narrative in a literary form represents, remind us that because they're breakdowns, they are not the way God made things. The way God made things is for life, for flourishing, for perfection, for providence, for all of those things. And I think as Christians, the greatest call of Laudato Si is to recognize that our responsibility is to work for that order of flourishing and life in creation, and to allow and enable and inspire all things, human and otherwise, to say Laudato Si, praise be to you, and to remind ourselves constantly that God calls us to give all we have for the good of creation. And that, to me, is really the core focus of how our prayer and how our education lead us into this fuller, lead us more fully into this splendid universal communion that Laudato Si is all about. So that is my in-depth exploration of chapter 6. We have just a few minutes for some questions and comments, but I'd love to hear responses from our seminar people or via the Q&A function from anybody that's out there in the webinar. Maria, please.
Yeah, I was just thinking when you talk about Francis and being idealistic about what we get at Eucharist, and what was passing through my mind is even in liturgy and in the construction of our churches, we keep nature outside. Some of the most beautiful churches that I've been to in my life, and even pagan sanctuaries, are places where nature is right in there in the experience of liturgy. And it's a shame, really. I mean, I've seen beautiful churches in Italy with glass walls where you can see everything. If you go to Greece to the Temple of Poseidon, out in this magnificent place that we've just made dark spaces, and I don't think it helps us to arrive at what Francis is talking about. So just a little comment on.
Great. I mean, think about architecture, right? That is a part of our tradition. So, here's my sort of proposal. Is maybe there's an architect out there in the audience, right? Is there a post Laudato Si church architecture? Can Laudato Si prompt us to rethink how we design and build churches? Maybe the new stained glass is nature itself, big clear windows that allow us to see, what's right there. as opposed to these. Now, not to say that that's a bad tradition, it's a beautiful tradition, right? But it can also be one of a way of reimagining. You know, you think of like the Pantheon in Rome, right? With the open hole in the ceiling, or, you know, open air churches in tropical climates, or as you said, in these different places. There's a question here. And I think that's what's really beautiful about Laudato Si, is it can challenge us to say, okay, how might we think about things differently on this side of the encyclical, you know, as opposed to before? That's great, Maria. And I'll bring in Carol's comment here. Oh, Tom has mentioned looking at the plant Trillium grandiflorium, sorry, that has a beautiful Trinitarian structure. And Carol mentions that I think this is so right, because I see it all the time in my classrooms. You know, the affluence in our culture is one of the things that makes it really hard for young people to live the gospel and participate in ecological conversion. I mean, whenever you see, you know, again, not to keep, you know, critiquing Elon Musk here, but, you know, 44 billion, I don't even know what that looks like, but, you know, $44 billion to buy an online platform, and you know, young people see that and they're amazed by it. You know, it's the Tesla complex, especially out here in Silicon Valley, where like Tesla is like the thing to have. You know, it's the sign of sort of who we have become as a human species and all these kinds of things. So I think you're absolutely right, Carol, that these are tough nuts to crack, so to speak. You know, they're not things that are going to die easily. Yeah. Other responses, questions, comments? Oh, go ahead, Maria. Yeah.
I just want to add to what Carol said. It's just the affluence, you know. I mean, you were talking about we eat fruit that's not in season. And, you know, I mean, part of the globalization, right, is that we share products and we help through this interchange. And I guess it's difficult because there's always a superabundance of everything in front of us. And so, you know, you talk about when you take your kids shopping, well, there's like 79 different choices of cereal. And so the world around us is physically structured with such a superabundance of things that you don't have to think about limit. You don't have to think about not having everything. The amount of food they put on your plate in a restaurant. I mean, we are just inundated by a sense of superabundance and illimitlessness. And I think unless you're graced with, this is a graced moment to be part of this course, really, and to think in a different way, removed from what society puts in front of you. And I think it's not just that students are affluent. I mean, the psychologists say that one of the problems with students is they have just too many choices. And I think that's true. There's just too much.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And if we think about that in terms of, you know, the technocratic paradigm or the global economy, these things that Pope Francis has created, you know, that is like the system operates in such a way. And this is where I think this anxiety that he talks about comes from, this compulsive consumerism, right? It's because we're constantly being fed new options, new opportunities, right? Or we have, you know, they change the phone charger, or they change whatever it is. So you have to buy a new one, right? But whenever you walk into a grocery store and you see all these options, there's something about that. And there's probably some sort of like deep evolutionary reason for this, where we see like, oh my gosh, there's so much food here. It's a land of abundance. We're back to the Garden of Eden, right? But it's like, you know, 19 different types of salad dressing or something like that, you know, and
Right.
God made all the different varieties of salad dressing for us or whatever, you know, that's the untold part of Genesis 2 is edited out. But, you know, like you think about all of these kinds of things, there's this flood of stimulation that says consume, consume, consume. And then you say, which one am I going to buy? You know, and there's anxiety there. So it's a combination of a compulsion to consume with that sort of saturation of you know, input that I think leads us to do that. And that's what's so challenging, because you're right, you know, everybody's right in how we're framing this. That is the challenge, is to be able to stop and to say, okay, what do I really need? What do I really need? Not like all these things are available to me, I can buy any of them if I want to, but which one of these do I really need? What beautiful, wonderful meal do I want to prepare, you know, to feed my family or to feed my community? What is the intentionality here? You know, what is the presence here? The way that I can be present to this act of buying that thinks about the whole network of factors, you know, rather than any one. And I think that's the humility and the sort of simplicity that Francis is calling for. And I think that's a great place to kind of, you know, leave us on that thought. So as we go into next week, building on that, I invite you, I just dropped in the chat first a picture of the chapel that Tom was referring to, so you can click on that JPG link to see that. And second, you know, there is the link to the Laudato Si Action Platform website. If you've never checked that out before, please do. Enroll. You can enroll in it so that you have access to all the resources. And for next week, I invite everyone, you know, seminar and webinar participants alike, come in with a couple of ideas about what we might do to turn this vision into practice. And that can be your own, in your local community or wherever it is, to really build this up and move this forward. So thank you all again for another great session, and I shall see you next week. Take good care.